So let's get started with our first interview. Professor Carlos Lopez is a professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, University of Cape Town, and an affiliate professor at Sciences Po Paris. He has held senior positions at the United Nations, including Political Director to Secretary General Kofi Annan, Under Secretary General of the United Nations, and Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa from 2012 to 2016. He was appointed in 2018 as the African Union High Representative for Partnerships with Europe and a member of the organization's reform team led by President Paul Kagame. He chairs the board of the African Climate Foundation. He has authored and edited more than 20 books and feature articles in CNN, Financial Times, China Daily, The Guardian, New African, among others. Professor Carlos Lopez joins me now from South Africa. Good morning, Prof, and good to see you.
Good morning, Nancy.
Good morning, Prof. It's such a, such a pleasure to see you again. The last time we spoke was in the heat of the pandemic, 2020, and that was like 4 years ago. How time flies. Welcome to you, Professor, on the show today.
Thank you.
Now, I think I'll start my first question by asking you, what do you think has changed in Africa in the last 4 years since I spoke to you?
Well, a lot has changed. Africa has been affected by the pandemic like all other regions of the world. But in our case, we demonstrated resilience, first from a sanitary point of view, given the demographics of the continent, the comorbidities that you have observed in other populations have not really taken a toll in Africa, so you had much better performance in terms of sanitary developments during the pandemic. But of course, the socioeconomic impacts were huge, and we are now facing a crisis of liquidity. The continent has always had this debt overhang that has not been solved, and during the pandemic, a lot of the savings went either to address the lockdowns and all the consequences economically, interruption provoked by the pandemic, and of course, also the debt service that became quite prohibitive. So we are now in a situation where the continent is facing difficulties like no other region, given that development aid is diminishing quite significantly, investments are drying up, and liquidity is becoming more and more difficult, as I mentioned. But despite that, out of the 20 fastest growing economies in 24, as projected by the IMF, 11 will be in Africa.
11, yes, will be Africa. And it's so startling also that the big economies in Africa are not part of those, are not part of those countries. But I guess we'll come to that in a bit. Prof, I normally read your insights. I think I've read a few of your articles, or even many. Could this be the century for Africa? And of course, you have a popular blog, Africa Cheetah Run. I haven't asked you this question, but I know you've been asked this question many times. So let me ask, let me follow the bandwagon. You, of course, you were on the African Economic Congress, which I am the founder. You were on there, I think in 2020. Yeah, where, yes, where you also spoke about Africa's development and transformation. Why do you liken Africa to the cheetah, which is the world's fastest animal? Unlike the lion, Africa is home to the lion. We're a tropical region, not like Asian tigers. I would suppose you would say, okay, African lion. Africa is a lion and not a cheetah. Can you just explain that to our viewers this morning?
Well, in fact, during the fastest period of growth in Southeast Asia, a lot of people coined the slogan that this was a Asian tiger's miracle. And when Africa at the beginning of the century started really posting some extraordinary performance, given the reduction of debt at that time, also the commodity super cycle helping, people start talking about lions on the move. This was actually the title of a book by McKinsey Company that eventually was also used elsewhere. And I want to demonstrate just metaphorically that lions are about show off. They don't do most of the work, the lionesses do. They are very territorial and their rate of efficiency is extremely low. They are not team players, so they go for anything, anytime without strategy. And that's precisely what Africa should avoid. Africa should be very much on a catch up mode with a lot of speed. It has to have a spirit of collective strategy, which is what the cheetahs represent. They are gender sensitive because they do all the same work and they are not territorial. So, in a way, we need to be very much in the catch up, fastest route that the cheetahs personify rather than the show off of the lions.
Rather than the show off of the lions. I personally feel attacked, Prof, because my zodiac sign is Leo. You know, and characteristics of lions. We are so majestic. We live pride, we a sense of family. We don't play with our families and all of that. But interesting analogy for you to say that the cheetah, of course, there's no gender disparity, a whole lot of stuff.
You are a lioness, Nancy.
Yes,
You're
yes,
not
I
a
am.
lion.
Yes, I am the lioness. And even on the pride of lions, the lionesses seem to do a lot more work.
Exactly. They do the work.
Yes, they do the work than lions. But do you still feel the same way, Prof? Because you've been saying this for a while, that Africa should be on a catch-up mode. We should actually be a cheetah, unlike lion or lionesses. Do you still think that we're still approaching development in the cheetah mode?
Well, Africa is now characterized by a lot of paradoxes. On one hand, if you look at the short term, people can say, oh, there are coups, there are difficulties in the political front, economically, there is this debt overhang that I mentioned, difficulties in terms of progress that is not very obvious in some of the largest economies. So all of that is true. But when you look into what is happening in the world, where most of the population in the richest regions and countries is aging very fast, Africa is going to have almost a monopoly of a new labor force. And that is going to create a very different dynamics from what people are prepared to accept. Some of the debates about migration may actually trump what is likely to happen, which is, sort of a scarcity of manpower, particularly for certain types of jobs that are not ready for automation and robotization. And Africa is going to have 1 in every 2 newborns starting as of now, which means that we have an absolute control over the youthness of the planet moving forward. And this is very, very important. But then you have 2 other megatrends that people also have to bear in mind. The climate megatrend that basically favors Africa in the sense that we have some of the largest potential for renewable energy, including green hydrogen production, according to the International Energy Agency. 60% of the possibilities are in Africa. And this is the energy of the future, if you want. But we have also strategic minerals that are going to be essential for the transitions. And therefore, Africa is going to have a major role to play in the transformation of climate to be much more adjusted to the targets that are quite ambitious. And finally, on technology, people tend to give a lot of importance to innovation, creativity, research and development, patent registration. All of that is very true. But people forget that the more tech-intensive products and processes are, the more appealing they are for younger population. And with the average age that is going to eat most of the European, Japan, US, and other countries, we are really going to face a dilemma where countries that have the best infrastructure for research, the best innovation, ecosystems, and that have certainly a lot of control over intellectual property are not going to be able to be the consumers of those because the consumers are going to be the younger people.
But
Therefore,
Prof, the young people are also poor people. Sorry to interrupt you. The young people are also poor people because we even have, of course, Africa is the most youthful continent in the world. We also have urban poor, very huge urban poor as well as rural poor. We have a population also that are not even economically as well as financially included. So I understand your argument that, of course, when these products come, they will need to be consumed, and they are consumed by also young people. But what would make us change? What will make Africa innovate as well as adapt to these transformations, especially around artificial intelligence now?
Well, artificial intelligence is a very good point to explain
Yeah.
why being poor is not necessarily going to be the future of Africa, in the sense that artificial intelligence creates two phenomena. One is it democratizes access to a lot of things, because you can just, for instance, in terms of education, with artificial intelligence, have access to a lot that was before completely primed with intellectual property. And now the intellectual property regimes will not be able to cope, and therefore they will be accessible. And because we have, the least broadband, the least internet access, all these things, we should not be completely fixed that this is going to be the solution, because our rates of growth are exponential in these areas, and therefore, in less than 20 years, we'll have complete coverage of broadband, internet access, and all the rest. So we'll have access to artificial intelligence. On the other hand, artificial intelligence is going to create huge value for those who control it, and can be all types of control, including taxonomy, certification of codes and language that is going to allow for artificial intelligence to operate. And this, of course, is going to give an advantage to countries that already have such capabilities. And obviously, Africa is not in the lot. But I would argue that, if you look into the trajectory of poverty in the world, we normally tend to see a lot of poor as sort of the future, but in fact, the trends are exactly the opposite. We have reduced poverty quite significantly, and the fact that Africa still has a lot of poor is because Africa has amazing demographics. If you just think that the population is going to double every 40 to 50 years, you can imagine that this catch up is very difficult. But the number of people going into middle class is astounding. Right now, the middle class of Africa is larger than the population of Brazil.
So what will cause us to grow? Because also from your articles, I have the sense from your articles that Africa has been growing, but not yet necessarily transforming. Because growth could actually be a bit different from transformation. And you've actually also said that we have state-led production, not state-led facilitation. For example, here in Nigeria, I've always said we have the Nigerian Customs Service that seems to always bring out, churn out its numbers to say, okay, we generated this, we generated that. Instead of the customs, of course, I'm not negating it should be a revenue earner, but a trade facilitator. So when I saw that in one of your articles, I could relate with you. So what will it take for Africa to not just grow? Because even in the case of Nigeria, I think in the last 10 years or 12, 13 years, we had huge economic growth. We were growing at about 7%. Nigeria was like the fastest growing economy on the African continent, yet we had a jobless growth. South Africa, where you are, is struggling right now with a lot of issues. Elections are just by the corner. Nigeria, we just concluded, as Senegal, one of the bright spots in Africa now in terms of even democracy and governance, producing the youngest leader on the African continent. So when you look at all of this, how would you say that we've done? How can we move from state-led production to state-led facilitation, and even in terms of governance on the African continent?
In fact, what you have very often is state-led non-production. He occupies the productive sector and doesn't produce it. No, I absolutely confirm that the growth without transformation is no quality growth, and it's not going to take us out of the doldrums. But what I'm very much enthusiastic about is how the prospects for industrialization in Africa are becoming real. You have lots of countries now that are becoming resource nationalistic, in the sense that they wouldn't like to export raw materials without transformation. That's very important. You have a number of industrial parks that are seeing a completely different take in terms of the value chains. You have negotiations in some of our soft commodities, in particular, like cocoa or coffee or tea, that are taking a completely different turn from what we're used to, where the countries are really very vocal about their interests. And you have all these debates about, whether gas is going to be an energy of transition for Africa, where you have proof that Africa's agency is becoming much more uh, affirmed than before. So for all these reasons, I have hope that industrialization is now becoming more intense. And of course, the continental free trade area is going to be the real boost for this to happen. And even in countries with large economies like Nigeria, that have very very mediocre growth, you can see that there are areas in those countries where growth is taking root. It's the case, for instance, in southwest Nigeria. You have a lot of economic activity taking shape. You have a lot of creativity. Nancy, during the pandemic, we had 5 unicorns that were born out of Nigeria.
Nigeria.
So it is very much a dynamic that has parts of the country that don't actually grow and others that do. And this is because the state is not playing its cards right. We need a smart state. We don't need an interventionist state. We need a smart state, one that creates the enablers, one that creates the right policy environment, and one that does the right negotiations at the international level. And I think this is a miss in most of the countries so far, but something that we have to fight for.
Okay, let me take it from where you stopped. You said we need smart states. You've also been one that has been canvassing that Africa needs to be more on the global stage. We need to be a permanent member at the AU, and we've successfully gotten that. So kudos to you, Prof, for lending your voice to you, such one of those voices on the African continent that is doing good. So AU has been added to the G20 now as a permanent member. I think that was last year. What do you think it means now for Africa? Of course, before AU, African Union was added, South Africa was there as a country. President William Ruto, at a time when AU was added, said that this will give Africa more visibility. Africa will be taken more seriously on the global stage. So what do you think that this means for Africa? That's one. The second question is also around Agenda 2063, because I also know that you're part of those, drafting of Agenda 2063. Where do you see us going? Because even here in Nigeria, for example, we've had different agendas at different times. Now in Nigeria, for example, we have Agenda 2050. There was a time we had Vision 2010, Agenda 2020, and all of that. All those years have come and gone, yet we've not seen meaningful transformation. So where will that leave us in 2063? That's second. The third question is around AFTA, which you mentioned. Sorry, Prof, that I'm bombarding you with a lot of questions. But as it's coming to me, I just needed to read it out. What you talked about on African Continental Free Trade Area, how much progress do you think that we have seen since, how many years now? The last time I think I interviewed the Wamkele Mene, His Excellency Wamkele Mene, sometime on the show. Was it 2 years ago or so, when he became the head at the African Secretariat in Ghana? So 3 questions, Prof.
Well, the aspirational agenda 2063 is a reflection of a certain level of maturity of the debate in Africa, because we have been discussing regional integration for a long time. Regional integration is an all-encompassing undertaking. You have infrastructure integration, you have pre-circulation of people, you have macroeconomic policy convergence, you have productive integration, which is value chains. And of course, trade is just one aspect of it. And if we just focus on trade without the rest, we are never going to see real integration. That's why Agenda 2063 is a much more comprehensive undertaking. And it's also much more ambitious. But this being said, when we were drafting it, it coincided with the period where the UN was drafting its Agenda 2030. where a lot of African diplomats had a very important role. And, we're in dialogue, and it was very interesting that some people at the end of the day consider that Agenda 2063 was overambitious and Agenda 2030 was realistic. It's exactly the opposite. Agenda 2030 is about finishing poverty, getting all the different elements of education and human capital, is health and so on fixed in a period that was not realistic. And we are seeing it now because even on climate, we are seeing us diverging from the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Agenda 2063, on the other hand, is about aspirations that have a much longer period to become effective. And I think it doesn't make sense if you don't translate it into something that is chewable, something that you can actually master. And those are the 10-year plans. And this is why it's very important for us to look into what was the flagship. And the flagship was the Continental Free Trade Area. If we get it right, we have sort of a platform for the other aspirations to see the light. And I would say that the timeline that we have so far is very realistic. In fact, if you compare with similar undertakings by the European Union in particular, that is the most advanced one, you can say that our timeline is not really bad. It's actually overperforming in certain areas. And I think a lot of the difficulties that we have with the tariff synchronization and agreements result from the largest countries, largest economies, having a bit more of skepticism about opening up their industrial policy convergence for reasons that are understandable. You have rules of origin, you have issues that have to do with intellectual property, you have issues that now come on the way of e-commerce. So these protocols that are now under finalization will give an extra boost to what has been so far a very good level of political commitment. So I'm optimistic in that front that Africans have discussed regional integration for a long time, just theoretically. Now they are doing things. And that's why the G20 and others are recognizing Africa, because you can't really appear in this fora as one if you don't have something that qualifies you as a single player or a unified player. And this is why the EU has always been admitted in these different fora and the AU has not. Now this is changing, and I think it's a very good indication of recognition that Africa now is talking with a single voice in a number of areas, and we saw it during the pandemic as well.
Prof, do you think that the AU still has that bite, which is expected of it? Because it's been criticized in the last few years, and you know what I'm talking about.
Well, I was very much involved in this reform program, and it was about adequating the AU to the needs of Agenda 2063. That's basically what it was about. And I would argue that the discussions have been a bit frustrating because, in particular, the financing of the organization is key for us to take full control of it. If you are funded largely by donors, you cannot really be able to unfold all the possibilities that come with these regional integration moves. And I think we have been frustrated by a lot of resistance to move into a new financing formula. We have worked on it. The group has made proposals. They have been adopted by the heads of state, but implementation is lagging. And that is just one aspect of it. Other very important proposals, all of them have been endorsed, are being implemented with a very, very slow pace. So I would accept the criticism that the African Union is not yet at the pace of change that is needed.
That is needed, yeah. Prof, let's talk about something that you've also said, which which I've internalized for a while now. You said that because of the perception of risk by China as against, is the perception of risk being different from the way the West perceives risk makes investors from China a better partner for Africa. Meanwhile, Africans are also having the skepticism around China, you know, the Chinese coming into Africa, the way they do business and all of that. China is a country of more than 1 billion, perhaps 1.3 billion people. They come in with their labor and all of that. So why are you saying that China seems to be a better partner for Africa, while also the West is also kicking and everybody's trying to get a slice of the pie on the African continent?
Well, it's our number one trading partner. It's our number one lender in sovereign debt. So it plays a very important role in our global relations and our integration into the value chains. I think the Chinese have a very recent history of accelerated industrialization. That's why they have a different perception of risk. And when they come to Africa, honestly, we have exaggerated the fact that they bring labor. It has happened during a period of time. Now labor is very expensive in China, so it's prohibitive for the Chinese companies to actually bring a lot of labor from China. It's much more enticing to employ local. And I think what the Chinese have in mind is basically a long-term prospect of trying to create a market that they know it's going to be colossal, because we are going to be occupying about 30% of the world's population. So this is going to be a very enticing opportunity, and they have this more longer term view. And I think the Western countries are still, in terms of stock, the most important partner of the continent, but they are sort of eroding that position by reducing both in terms of development aid, in terms of investments, and also in terms of trade. And this is going to be the opportunity for others to come into play. And I'm particularly excited with the fact that the middle powers, Gulf countries, Turkey, India, and to a certain extent, Russia and Brazil, are equally interested in Africa, because Africa needs a bargaining position that is comfortable, so it can take the best of everybody. And I think that's applicable to the Chinese, but also to others. I believe that when the population aging will hit Europe in terms of their strategies, it's just starting now, they will realize that it is important to have Africa as a partner. And then, you know, their perceptions of risk will have to evolve.
Okay. Prof, finally, because I know you have to go, let's talk about the lessons for African leaders, especially in the light of the youngest elected president on the continent, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, BDF as his tagged. I think he's 44, or is it 41? You know, being elected. I also saw what you put down on X when all that was going through. What do you think? Will this really, you know, resuscitate the quest for young leadership or younger leadership in Africa? See what is happening in Togo, for instance, and what's even happened in Senegal before BDF came on board. Do you see this resuscitating young leadership, that youthful leadership on the African continent? And do you see this also as a sign to sit tight leaders on the African continent? Because you've actually said that demography for Africa is also a gain. Will that gain also translate into good governance?
Well, certainly when you have a very young population, which is the case in most African countries, you have to have different types of politics. Because the youth is more restless, and it's obviously demanding levels of engagement with their use of technology, their urban culture, that are not the traditional way Africans have played the political game. And they are a bit nervous that, you know, sort of the establishment that exists in most countries is not very attentive to their new types of demands. And they are going to contest, and they are going to contest it in a way that either provokes change, like we just saw in Senegal, or is going to provoke levels of contestation that can be taken as, you know, sort of a driver for populists to occupy space. You know, you can have a coup provided it says the right things for the young people, immediately applaud it. So it is really the responsibility of the political class to adjust to this modernity that is required to deal with such a young population. And this is not obvious. I think in Senegal it happened, with a lot of difficulties, but we hope that it was a lesson also for many.
Okay. All right, I think we'll leave it at that, Prof. It's so nice speaking with you again after 4 years. I hope that we don't take another 4 years to speak with you.
I'm available,
Yeah,
Nancy. Thank
yes.
you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you.
All right, I've been speaking with Professor Carlos Lopez, the Professor Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, University of Cape Town in South Africa.